Hello, Lakeview family. Hope you are doing well this week as we round out June. The month of June is almost over. When we gather on Sunday, it'll be June 30th, the last day of June. Crazy how the time is flying. I'm excited to be together. I love our times of worship. Last Sunday was so awesome having Robert and Janet a part of the worship gathering to be able to pray for them as they're rounding out their journey in rehab for their recovery process, and for us to recognize the way the church can come alongside people in this discipleship journey, in being like Jesus, in being formed and shaped into the image of Christ for the sake of others. That is what the call of the church is about, right? To join people exactly where they are in life with no pretense and no judgment. And I think the best thing for me about Sunday was the times of bringing Robert and Janet to church and taking them home, and the conversations that spurred them sharing on Sunday morning, because it rose out of their gratitude for the church. And both of them sharing their experience with church to this point hasn't been the best, but how they have felt. And Janet articulated that on Sunday, how they have felt and the love that they have sensed and God's presence that they have sensed through you, through the church, is fantastic. And we should be praising God for that, regardless of how their journey looks from this point forward. For me, and I mentioned it a little bit on Sunday, we're almost 15 years into my sister's recovery. And in the midst of those 15 years have been multiple relapses, divorce, difficulty. But ultimately, as I step back as a family member of someone going through addiction, who is recognizing and surrendered to God's working in her life, my sister, is the consistent trajectory of God's faithful presence and working in a heart and conviction, maybe not at the speed or pace that I would wish, maybe not the decisions that I would think are the best in that moment, but recognizing that God is at work and trusting in God's divine presence and divine wisdom. And also in the midst of my journey, praying those things, that God, you would use me in ways that aid in what you're doing in my sister's life or in the life of those that I'm journeying with. And that should always be our prayer. And I think that's a beautiful segue actually into what we're talking about this Sunday. It's a very unique text and something that will probably be hard for a lot of us and uncomfortable at best, maybe for some people. But it's David's lament of the death of Saul and Jonathan. A couple weeks ago, we took a break in the story of Saul's story, right, to see when David was anointed. And there's those two, Samuel went to Ramah, right? I talked about those two statements that are made at the beginning and at the end of the text section of text that we've read, that talk about really kind of taking this like a parenthetic piece of the story, like pulling it out of Saul's story to kind of see this is happening in the midst of all of Saul's journey. This little whoop, it's like a little air bubble that pops in. I think this is very similar in nature to that. In the arc of David's story, we kind of take a pause. This is again in the midst of David's ascension, and in typical fashion, in that context and time, and as you read in other stories, especially in Kings and Chronicles, with the transition of kings with the people of Israel, when one is dead, the other one is ascended, and sometimes it's because that person killed the other king, or that king died, and it's his son is immediately put into the throne. So you have this process that kind of is pretty expedient, and what we see is this slow rise of David. Because even initially, he's just king of Judah, not even of all of Israel. So there's this slow rise of David to be king. And I love this spot of this lament. And it's not a typical lament like we would see in Psalms or in Lamentations, which we'll talk about. And we'll talk about kind of the four-part nature of lament. We'll sing a couple songs that kind of help us kind of guide through that process. And I know it is hard talking about loss and grief and death, and these things are difficult, but it is a part of the human story, and it's a part of our journey. And as a church, as a local church, I was just talking to Pastor Kerr about this morning, who in the last month has experienced the loss of her father and her father-in-law and her aunt. Like, death is real. Death is a part of the human story, and God meets us in those spaces. And especially, I believe that God raised up the church to be a means of grace, to represent what we believe to be true about the gospel, that out of death comes resurrection and new life. That's the focal point of the cross, that journeying through the cross and the pain and the struggle and the hardship of the reality of the death of Jesus leads us to fully embrace what the resurrection actually means. So in this story with David, especially when we think about David being right after God's own heart, that when God anointed David and said, God, I look at the heart. Man looks at the things of the flesh, but I look at the heart. Recognizing that David was a man after God's heart, his pattern, his heart was the will of God, to do the will of God, to walk in radical obedience. So what we can infer, and I think is really true, is that the next obedient step for David in following what God had for him, and not just for David, right, but for God to work with the people of Israel, his people. Again, this is less about David and more about God, but on that arc and that trajectory of where David was going as being led by God, the next right step was to grieve. Was to grieve himself, was to mourn the loss of a mentor and a dear friend, and to call the people of Israel to grieve, which should not be taken lightly. We can say what we want to say about Saul, and there are some true things to say, particularly because he was the answer for the people who wanted a king to be like everyone else. But if we think about it from the people's perspective, to have that king, then to lose that king, the king that would go in battle and fight. And Saul had done many wonderful things to help them be a nation that conquered other nations. It was very kingly. So giving the people of Israel time to grieve that, and to then recognize who God had brought in Saul's place, was a way of God moving them to say, what you want isn't what is best for you. But I'm going to recognize that that's still hard for you to handle, and losing what you think is best is hard. And so God gives them that, and calls David to lead the people to grieve. And also, it's so fascinating how David grieves for Saul. We could argue that Saul was David's enemy. And then you have him grieving over Saul in ways that memorializes him as somebody who was indeed God's anointed. And it ties us in. It makes us think about Jesus' call to love our neighbors and to love our enemies. So here you see David grieving for Jonathan, which makes sense when you look at the nature of their relationship and the covenant that they made together and the bond that they had as best friends. Makes sense for David to grieve Jonathan in that way, but to grieve Saul and to say that Saul and Jonathan are united in this grief and putting them kind of on the same playing field is fascinating and says something about who God calls us to be as God's people, and recognizing that David could have not grieved for Saul. He could have just moved on, but he didn't. He grieves for Saul in a significant way. So there's things that we'll talk about on Sunday about grief. We'll talk about lament, and not just grief of death. There's lots of things that we grieve over, that we experience as loss and pain. There's job loss, there's divorce, there's dysfunction in families, there's addiction. There's a whole host of things, bullying, things of all ages, things that we experience that bring about pain and hurt and loss and frustration and anger, and things that call us to then lament, to cry out to God. And so there's things that I think we'll learn, that we'll look at, and I'm hopeful for what we can do, and ultimately where this thing will land when we head to the table at the end of our time gathered together. Where this will land is the call of the church to be a means of grace, of hope and healing to the people. So I look forward to being with you. If you want to read ahead, it's 1 Samuel chapter 17, and I believe it's verses 1 through 17. But it's Saul's lament, or David's lament of Saul and Jonathan. You will see it in the text. Have a wonderful rest of your week, and we will see you all Sunday. Blessings.